Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this webinar, which is part of a series of workshops that we have developed and co-developed with teachers, and they're being organised by the Youth Resilience Unit at Queen Mary University of London. So, as many of you may have seen in the news and social media, that since the pandemic, loneliness has become an increasingly recognised health threat. So in 2023, the WHO recognised this issue and launched a commission to foster social connection. So we've known actually before the pandemic that loneliness is common in young people and can be linked to poorer health. But there are still very few formal and informal support mechanisms to help young people manage loneliness. And also, loneliness is still considered to be a stigmatizing issue for young people to talk about. So we're really pleased today that we have Dr. Helen MacIntyre, who is the former head of evidence at the Campaign to End Loneliness, and who still works as an independent researcher, an honorary research fellow at the Institute of Education at UCL, to come to talk to us in more detail about loneliness in young people and what we can do in schools and in classrooms to help young people. She'll be joined also by Dr. Lily Verity and Dr. Laura Riddleston, who are loneliness researchers at the University of Manchester and at Queen Mary as well in this session. So I will hand over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, so I'm Helen, and thanks also from me for coming today and for taking time to hear about what we think is some key information relevant to addressing loneliness among children and young people at school. And there are a few reasons for today's session and a couple of things to say before we really get going. We have written this brief guide to loneliness among young people and children at school, and we wanted to begin to introduce the content of the guide to educators such as yourselves. It's a draft guide. It's based on my drawing together of research evidence, but we want to get feedback from you on how useful and accessible it is and whether you think there's anything we need to add or change. And also to find out a bit about your thinking in relation to the issues involved. So for that reason, this will be a bit of an interactive session, and we'll be asking you to answer questions along the way using Slido. But please do also put any questions or comments in the Zoom chat. I'm not sure whether we'll be having much time for live discussion about those questions, but my colleagues will be responding to anything you put in the chat. So another space for conversation there. If you received the link to the guide and downloaded it, you may have noticed that there are some links to resources still to be added and one or two broken links, and that will also be sorted out in the final version, which you can sign up to receive in the feedback form we're going to share with you towards the end. It's also an opportunity for us to make longer term contact with you. So as I just alluded to, towards the end of the session, I'll be sharing a feedback and contact us form where you can let us know if you're interested in keeping in touch with us. And that might be because you want to receive the final version of the guide, discuss work you're doing on loneliness in your school, because you're interested in partnering on future research on loneliness at school, or because you want to be kept informed about progress of the research projects that Jennifer, Lily and Laura's team is undertaking. So onto the guide. These are the aims of this brief guide to addressing loneliness in the school context. And today we want to find out something from you about how well it meets these aims. So we want to make it easy for school staff to better understand loneliness among their children and young people, and easy for them to think about whether there is a need to address loneliness in their school, and if so, how this can be done. And I'd like to say at this point, we've tried to encompass both primary and secondary phases in what we're saying, although the evidence is more focused on the older ages, so it might come across as slightly more geared to that age group. Okay, the first thing I'm going to ask you is what questions you have about loneliness at school and how it can be addressed. And just to do that kind of privately, I'd like you to take a minute to either jot them down or just think about them, but somehow keep hold of them. So at the end, you can let us know which of your questions have not been adequately answered by the content of the guide, which we're going to go through now. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do that. Briefly, this is an overview of the structure of the guide. It's about 10 pages in total. A third of the main text is focused on explaining more about loneliness. About 2/3 is a run through of things it would be good to think about to create a less lonely school. But there are also these other things in the yellow box. A big part of the intention in developing this guide was to share a set of resources that can support your work and be used to develop deeper understanding of the issue. Because in those 10 pages, you're certainly not going to be able to tell you everything you need to know in depth. So there are links to selected resources at relevant points in the text. And there's a full resource list at the end. And we'd like to add to this to develop a bigger resource bank over time. And then there's a set of references actually in a separate document for anyone who wants to look more at the research evidence sources that underpin what we've written about here. And there's a link, as I mentioned in the feedback form, to share contact details and give feedback at the end. So we'll know if that's something you're interested in receiving. So we're going to mainly take time today to look at the content of the first two sections of the guide and to gather some of your thinking around them. First, about loneliness. And beginning with definitions, let's spend a bit of time thinking about what loneliness is. I'd like to begin by knowing what you think, and I'm asking you to think about how you can know which, if any of these children are lonely, or think about one of your students or pupils who you would say is lonely. How do you know, and what makes you think that they are? So this is the first Slido. You can join and respond on your phones using the barcode, or on a web browser using the number code on the slide. And I'll just pause there to give you a chance to say how you would think. How do you know whether a child or young person is lonely? Okay, great. Maybe withdrawn, on their own at break and lunchtime. Socially isolated. Withdrawn. It's not always obvious, good point. Not interacting. Spend a lot of time talking to teachers. Okay, a lot of time online. Okay. Yeah. I mean, something that's coming out in your responses is that it's not always easy to know if someone else is lonely. I mean, research that's been done among adults provides some evidence that someone can know if their friend is lonely, but that judgment hasn't been pinned down to very specific observable behaviours. So because loneliness is this subjective internal experience, the most reliable way to know if someone is lonely is if they tell you. But even then, as Jennifer already mentioned, it's complicated because there's a significant stigma attached to loneliness. And so individuals may be extremely reluctant to talk about it and ask for help. They may not even acknowledge it to themselves or be aware of it themselves. It's really, really useful to have your responses there. These things are certainly all indicators. But I'm going to pass over to pause that. There's more, hang on, there's a couple more responses coming through. I don't want to cut you off. I think we will still be able to gather your responses. So I'll just move on to the next slide. I'm going to hand over to Lily now, because she is going to say a bit more about the nature of loneliness among young people. It's something she knows a lot about from her own research.
Thanks, Helen. So loneliness is the uncomfortable feelings that arise when a person feels dissatisfied with their social relationships. And that can be in terms of quality, or, sometimes people want a wider connection, social network of friends. So it's all about how a person's kind of subjective feelings about their own social relationships. And it is a significant issue in adolescence, particularly, although we see that it occurs across a person's life. Loneliness research shows that loneliness remains kind of low and stable in childhood, and then peaks in adolescence, and then we see it peak again in older adulthood. So often, we've heard about loneliness in older adulthood, but not so much about how it peaks in adolescence. And we think that this is partly to do with the social and developmental challenges faced during adolescence. So there's a lot of transitions that happen during that point. You might move from one school to another and have those challenges of having to connect with new people. There's developmental challenges in terms of identity development, so learning about who you are, and forming those connections with other people. Maybe the friends that you made when you were younger now don't have those same values and beliefs that you're developing as you get older. So there can tend to be a mismatch, and then we see instability in those friendships and relationships as we move into adolescence. So it can be particularly tricky, so it makes sense that loneliness occurs at this point. And whilst we see prevalence rates across the world are different, on average 17.9% of students across the world report feeling lonely at some point, and that's at school. Thanks, Helen. So whilst loneliness is an unpleasant experience, it is thought to be adaptive. So it does have kind of a mechanism that helps us to connect to other people, because it motivates us to want to kind of overcome loneliness and reevaluate our relationships with other people. And for most people, this is a transient experience, or someone feels lonely, say when they move from primary school to secondary school, and then as they see that they're making these new connections, and overcoming those negative feelings, it leads to social reconnection and loneliness dissipates. However, for some, loneliness can become long-term, and then we see kind of detrimental outcomes such as poorer mental and physical health. And we think of this as kind of like a loneliness loop. So as someone feels lonely, it causes them to kind of look at the social relationships that they have and become hyper-vigilant to things that might be wrong with them, and that can lead to more negative expectations of their social interactions, and creating kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where they go into social interactions expecting something bad to happen, and then it does, and that leads to further loneliness. So what we want to do is provide young people with the tools and support to navigate those experiences of loneliness, so that we can help them to reconnect, understand better about what they need and want from social relationships, that can prevent loneliness from becoming chronic and just be experienced transiently.
Thanks, Lily. And I guess that's what we're trying to do here, is to kind of equip people better to help people cope, help young people cope. So in the guide, we've distilled the definition down to this: that loneliness comes about when we're unhappy with the quality or quantity of our relationships, We also highlight that it's accompanied by negative emotions. It's not the same as being alone. You can be lonely in a crowd, which might actually be quite characteristic of young people's experience at school. We emphasise that important fact that Lily mentioned, that everyone experiences loneliness. The kind of loneliness we are concerned about, severe loneliness, so long-lasting or frequent or very intense. Okay, so how many are affected by loneliness? What's the scale of the problem in our schools? So Lily mentioned that average 17% figure among young people from international data. Figures do vary somewhat depending on the measures used, but from UK data, in late primary school and secondary school years, even before the COVID pandemic, the percentage of young people who said they were lonely often or always was 11%, so significantly greater than for adults, where the figure is around 6%. And in 2022, an even higher number of 15-year-olds said they were lonely specifically at school. There's limited data for younger children, but the figures are likely to be lower, as would be expected, because of that, in relation to that peak in adolescent that Lily talked about. Some evidence suggests it'll be closer to the 6% adult figure, but even then, that's around 2 children in a class of 30, so thousands of children across our schools, and there's evidence of long-lasting impact even after severe loneliness has come to an end. So, it's an issue for a lot of young people, and which is highlighted by this as well. Moving on to impacts. Why does loneliness matter? What do we know about the likely outcomes of the kind of severe loneliness we're so concerned about? Well, these are all things where there's good evidence of an association with severe loneliness. So more negative attitudes to school, lower educational attainment, poorer mental health, worse physical health, and health damaging behaviours. So it's not just an unpleasant experience, it has important implications. And there is this worrying feature of loneliness, that it can combine with these other factors to create negative cycles that keep repeating, to kind of trap someone and potentially exacerbate their negative frame of mind. It can be hard to escape from severe loneliness. And one version of that Lily mentioned is that mental health problems can lead to withdrawal from social situations, disrupt relationships, compounding loneliness with further negative effects on mental health. Another is that pressure and challenges of schoolwork can undermine capacity to address loneliness, which in turn reduces capacity to manage workload and increase the sort of pressure that's felt around schoolwork. So quite a sort of education specific version of that cycle, I suppose. Okay. It's also important to note that some groups of children and young people are disproportionately affected. And of course, they may face a combination of the following issues. So age-wise, that includes teenagers. It's an age when peers become more important. And Lily mentioned the issues that may be feeding into that. Those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds may be particularly affected, and this could be, for example, because they have fewer resources to access social opportunities. It's maybe of interest to note that there's a project led by this research team, in fact led by Delia Furman at King's College London, but involving the other colleagues here. And it's called the Unite project, which is aiming to dig deeper into just how young people from these disadvantaged backgrounds come to be lonelier. Another disproportionately affected group, marginalised groups, perhaps from a cultural minority or a sexual or gender minority, who are likely to face discrimination or perhaps to feel different from others. And those with other challenging life experience, for example, if you've been bereaved or a young carer. And it's perhaps, none of this is perhaps so surprising, but it does go to highlight a very important point. Loneliness, including among children and young people, is not just an issue of individuals who are somehow socially inept. It's much more a problem of the social environment and the context that young people find themselves in. And I think this is something very much to bear in mind when we're thinking about creating less lonely schools. Adjusting the environment and a community's attitudes to one another can lead to changes in loneliness, which I think is a hopeful thing.
Oh, God.
And there is evidence that schools can make a difference, specifically that they can lessen the negative impacts of severe loneliness on well-being. So next, drawing on research evidence, I'm going to highlight some of the things to think about for preventing loneliness at school and for addressing severe loneliness when it does affect students. And I wanted to say at this point that we know how hard-pressed schools and school staff are. We're trying not to add a huge extra burden. And I think many of the things I'll be talking about will be things that you already do, or which could be perhaps tweaked. It's really such a lot about everyday practices. So these are some broad principles for what we are suggesting. Essentially, Lily and colleagues who've written about this before suggest applying a belonging check to different aspects of school life to ensure that they're conducive to social connection and to a sense of belonging and wider well-being. Because of this need to optimise the school environment, we suggest a substantial focus on whole school and whole class approaches, system approaches, a bit less on support for individual young people, although we do also say something about that. Obviously, you already have a huge amount of expertise. You are the experts in this. We intend that our suggestions should build on that and should be adapted to need in the context of your school. So what follows is not a strict, inflexible set of rules. It's for you to use as a kind of framework for your thinking. And a strong suggestion from previous work on this is that students should be involved in decisions that might have an impact. Since loneliness is a subjective experience, only they will really know what is having a positive or negative impact, or indeed no impact at all. Okay, so to begin, things for your belonging check at the school organisational level. Do staff understand enough to equip them to address loneliness at school? Do they need training? There is some online training, a link here from the Campaign to End Loneliness for adults. And there's more information for teachers within some of the resources in the guide. And one key thing for staff to understand, which we've mentioned a couple of times already, is that loneliness stigma. It often has very negative connotations, which cause shame among young people that can prevent them from seeking help. And that means how staff talk to students about loneliness is really important, since it may make someone who is feeling very lonely feel worse, which would be good to avoid. Policies. Are policies informed by what we know about loneliness? For example, it's very important to think about loneliness in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion policies, given the connection between loneliness and discrimination that I've already mentioned. An inclusive school environment is crucial. And also anti-bullying policies are critical, since there's a very well-established link between bullying or victimisation and loneliness. Something about school environments. There's some really interesting recent research from the University of Glasgow, from a team there, showing that different places within a school can be more lonely than others. And it's important to consider that some groups may find some places difficult, particularly difficult. For example, noisy, crowded school corridors for autistic students. So understanding how places around the school are experienced can inform action to make them safe, comfortable, and socially supportive environments that encourage participation. Monitoring and measurement is also something to think about. Do you know how many children or young people in your school are severely lonely, and whether that's changing over time as you take action to minimise it? There are some links to possible measurement tools you could use as part of a wellbeing survey if you don't do so already. And we're going to hear a bit more in a bit about a new youth loneliness measurement scale. That's a lot of talking from me. I'm going to pause and come back to you now. I'm going to ask at this point in the session, what would you say are the main barriers to taking action on loneliness in your school? We'd be interested to know what some of the key challenges are. So again, you can use the barcode or the code in your web browser to respond on Slido. Yep, staff capacity. Was expecting that. Yeah. Time to talk one-to-one. Mounting pressure. Interesting, relationships not prioritised. Yeah, pressure on curriculum. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about that one in relation to the evidence that there's a negative impact on loneliness in relation to educational outcomes. It's you know, the piling on the pressure is not going to necessarily help with those exam outcomes, is it? But there is so much pressure. It's real need for prioritisation of relationships. This is really, you know, I kind of expected to hear this from you. It's really good to hear that you're kind of reinforcing that. It's something that we need to push on, and we need to sort of campaign for more space to focus on those relationships. These are all really good things for us to think about. Okay, apologies, I'm gonna move on to the next thing, but there'll be, you know, space in that feedback form to reiterate some of these things. I'm going to talk a bit more now about carrying out a belonging check at the interpersonal and individual levels, where you're potentially able to directly work with young people to improve their understanding of loneliness, their social experiences and relationships, and their ability to cope with loneliness effectively. So first, in terms of understanding, we're suggesting that there's a need for explicit teaching about loneliness and social connection. I suppose that's very much in the domain of the RHSE curriculum, and that's important so that they can understand their own experiences of loneliness or that of others, and are better equipped to play a role in creating supportive and inclusive environments. Again, it's important to take into account that issue of stigma in teaching children about loneliness, since it would be so easy to make young people feel worse or expose them to negative judgments from others if they're talking about their own experiences. We've included some teaching resources in the guide. There's one link here, and I particularly recommend this pack of lessons and assembly plans and other things produced by the Anna Freud Centre in conjunction with the Mental Health Foundation. This is designed for older secondary age kids to deliver lessons to year 7s or 8s, so kind of peer teaching. But I think they could equally be delivered by a teacher, and I think they could be adapted reasonably easily for other age groups. If any of you get a chance to try them out, it would be great to know how well you think they work. We already talked about the fact that loneliness is accompanied by negative emotions and unhelpful patterns of thinking that can lead to a downward spiral into long-term severe loneliness. So this section is key, I think. Work can be done to try and equip children and young people to better withstand loneliness when they encounter it. That's partly about building up self-confidence and self-esteem, including in relation to social interactions. The link isn't here, but in the guide, there's a link to a fantastic organisation in Holland. Unfortunately, nothing like that operating here. It's called Join Us, but you can look at the translated version of their website, and they talk about their approach of giving children positive social experiences and giving them opportunities to reflect on them and perhaps to build up their confidence and a more balanced view of how their strengths, I suppose, in relation to the kind of interactions that they're having with other people. So that Join Us website is worth a look. It's partly about making opportunities to challenge kids' overly negative perceptions of their social interactions with others and to give them a balanced view of why things sometimes go wrong in social situations. It's not all about them being inept in some way. And so trying to demonstrate to them that there is scope change. Finally, it's important to help children and young people develop healthy strategies for managing the negative emotions that can accompany loneliness and which can lead to anxiety and depression. I know there's a lot to unpack in that kind of collection of things. And in the final guide, there'll be some more resources which can help with those more psychological aspects of loneliness, including something on fostering good emotion regulation strategies. Next, have children got enough opportunities to interact with their peers at school and support to help them have successful interactions? And there are many times and places in the school environment with potential for children to interact with one another, to experience relationships and learn about how to make and maintain them. So does that happen enough in classrooms, in the playground, in the canteen, or at after school clubs? And I guess we have to be really careful. We have to think about this and be really careful that these places enhance social experience and interactions instead of limiting them. So kind of one extreme example from my PhD work, which was about children's interactions during school meal times, is that I came across a few extreme examples which I thought were quite startling, where talking while eating had been banned. So immediately sort of social experience cut off. I think it's really important to think about enhancing places and spaces for children's interactions with one another and how they can be made positive. Okay. And when you talk about youth loneliness, often the first question is it because of social media and because of smartphones? And I'm sure this is at the forefront of your minds. It's a really hot issue. And I know that there was research reported this week about the negative impact of more hours on a phone being linked to poorer well-being for school students. The evidence, such as it is, suggests benefits and detriments depending how social media is used. Perhaps good if it can facilitate authentic relationships, bad if it's used to excess, to disengage, or as a medium for bullying. So the question is whether children and young people need support to use social media in healthy instead of unhealthy ways. Very easy to say that, I know, more difficult to achieve it. There's one resource here from UK Youth, but I'm sure there are others that you know about, and it would be great if you can share any of those with us that you think are valuable. Okay. Are school staff supportive in ways that minimise loneliness? Well, I mean, given what you've said about pressures of time, this is a tough one, I know. There's evidence, though, that there are lower levels of loneliness where there's a supportive school and classroom climate, where there's a positive disciplinary approach, and where students perceive teachers as interested in their learning, as supportive of cooperation, and supportive of the development of good peer relationships. Again, you've mentioned that there just is not a lot of time for that focus, but this kind of really highlights how important it is that we perhaps need a big shift in our emphasis in our schools to make sure that we can focus on support for development of those positive relationships. And of course, all that requires that teachers and school staff are cared for and supported as well. Okay, finally, is there access to specialised tailored support for those children and young people who need it? So some young people will need individual support to overcome severe loneliness and to kind of sort out difficult life challenges that may be causing it or may result from it. It's very much likely to be tied up with mental health difficulties, which we know have grown so much. There are a couple of links to resources here. One to a website that supports children and young people who've been through trauma, very much recognises that loneliness is an element of the damaging effects of trauma. One on making psychological support informed by what we know about loneliness, although I have just noticed that the link for that isn't working at the moment. I'll make sure that that's sorted for the final version of the guide. Okay, so back to you now with some questions. Having heard about all those areas for a belonging check, realistically, given those constraints of time, which areas of school life do you think you and your school staff can best influence to address student loneliness if you were going to start doing it in the next month or so? Would be good to know from you. Great, lunch times. Yeah. Circle times. Yeah, presumably time when you can talk about loneliness and teach children a bit more about loneliness. Yeah, part of everyday practice to focus on positive relationships. Use of buddies. Yeah, working in groups and trying to organise things so no one's left out. Greeting culture, interesting. When I worked in kind of different contexts for addressing loneliness and social isolation, we were very big in thinking about how to create a warm welcome at school. That kind of initial contact was so important. Okay. This is really useful. Thank you. Again, it would be great for you to kind of perhaps say more about this in the feedback form when we get to it. Okay, I'm going to move on to another poll now. Sorry to bombard you a bit at this point. I just wonder if you could go back to that original set of questions about loneliness. Do you know what? I'm going to jump on because I think we're going to end up short of time. I'm going to jump on and hand back to Lily for a moment because she's going to talk to you about the youth loneliness scale work that they're doing. Lily, back to you.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so we just wanted to give a bit of an overview of the Youth Loneliness Scale project, which is the project that myself, Jennifer, and Laura work on, and Helen has also worked on with us. So, as mentioned, we need appropriate measures of loneliness for young people. In order to, gauge how many young people are experiencing loneliness and to help young people get the appropriate support that they need. So the project that we work on is aiming to develop an age-appropriate measure of loneliness for young people aged 10 to 24, that involves co-production with young people and operates across the UK. So the reason why we have co-production, and this is a really important part of the project, is because previously measures for loneliness haven't taught to young people about what they think loneliness is, and it's very much been based on research with adults. So you would think that the first step of understanding what loneliness is for young people and how to measure it would be to ask them what it means to them. How does it arise in the social context? How do they cope with it, and how is it understood by them? So the progress that we've made so far is that we have worked with young people through focus groups and arts workshops to develop statements that will make the items for our questionnaire about loneliness to hopefully truly reflect their experiences. And these statements have been reviewed and refined with input from young people who have experienced loneliness to make sure that they're relevant and meaningful. So now what we're doing is looking to evaluate those final statements that have got through all of the refining and reviewing stages, and we're inviting young people to take part in a survey to help us to further evaluate those statements, and your students' participation would play a key role in shaping our understanding and improving support for young people in the future. So you can get in touch with myself or Laura. It might be that you want to do, contact me if you're close to Manchester, or Laura if you're close to London. It's up to you. We also have our Youth Loneliness Scale Project website that you can visit and see what we're getting up to and learn more about the project. So we just wanted to give a heads up that this is going on, and you can be involved if you would like to. I think there's also a chance to say whether you would like to be involved on the feedback form. Yeah.
Right, on to the final part of the session. As I said, we can't cover everything in depth in a short guide, but we have tried to include links to useful resources, and we will be adding some additional things to the final version. These are the main types of resources that are included so far. So some things on classroom and assembly resources for learning, some school-wide programmes that might be of interest, online resources focused on aspects of youth loneliness that are not specific to school. There are some training materials on loneliness for adults, some summaries of research on youth loneliness, information on loneliness measurement, signposting to organisations outside of school who offer support to children and young people experiencing loneliness. Got some links to examples of local social prescribing services for younger people. There seem to be more and more of those now. And a list of academic references used for writing this guide. And I just wanted to ask you which of those categories are going to be most useful to you. So there's a poll there, and we can focus on building up resources in the areas that you think are going to be most useful. I think I've put in that you can put your 3 top areas of interest there. It would be great if you are able to kind of complete that via the poll. It's up now. Again, thank you. So much more sort of, focused on practical resources that you can use in school and on training for adults. Then I didn't expect anyone to put the list of academic references there, which I was right about, which is why I put it at the bottom. So, okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. Time is a little bit short now. Since that's a run through of the draft of our brief guide. I hope it's been interesting and useful. Since we want to maximise the feedback we get from you and the opportunities to stay in touch, we have built time into the final part of the hour for you to complete our feedback and contact form. You can add any other thoughts there on what you've heard and let us know the purposes for which you're happy to stay in touch.